topic. At the outset, I'm thankful to AIOS and Neeraj for having me part of this prestigious course. The topic I'm going to discuss is if you have imperfect visual acuity, postoperative visual acuity after perfect surgery, what could go wrong? And the topic that I'm going to cover is errors in refraction. Is that the cause? So what went wrong even after a perfect surgery and the factors that can affect postoperative vision? One of the causes could be preoperative refraction. So a thorough manifest refraction is to be completed and checked against a cycloplegic refraction. Having both refractions will help identify patients with latent hyperopia as well as help guard against overestimating myopic patients. And the errors that could occur are errors in retinoscopy, errors in cycloplegia, errors in autorefraction, and refraction not done by the operating surgeon himself. And the errors in retinoscopy could be because the patient, what we ideally should do, patient should be asked to fixate on a distant target in order to relax accommodation. And if the patient is not fixating on a distant target, then it may lead to erroneous retinoscopy. Distance of retinoscopy, we really have to take care because normally we are used to subtracting one diopter for doing refraction at a distance of 1 meter. But if the working distance between your retinoscope and the phoropter is less than that, say about half a meter, then you need to subtract 2 diopters from the final spherical correction to account for this. So correct value should be subtracted in order to get the correct retinoscopy values. If unskilled refractionist is there, maybe your optometrist who is not very skilled is doing, then he has to see that the axis of the beam should align with the axis of the motion. Confusion can be particularly created by scissoring reflexes, which need to be neutralized accordingly. And other factors are not using the current or latest retinoscopy finding and retinoscopy not performed by the operating surgeon himself, because retinoscopy depends immensely on the skill and experience of the examiner. Hence, there can be subjective variation in the retinoscopic values. There can be errors in cycloplegia because while performing retinoscopy, outcome measures rely deeply on the patient's cooperation and his ability to maintain distance fixation. And the fixation shifts causing fluctuating reflexes, loss of cooperation, and latent hyperopia. They can all be unfavorable factors affecting the results. So it is very important to do cycloplegic refraction and equally important to use appropriate cycloplegic agents. There can be errors in preoperative assessment. Proper history taking is very important. When a patient first presents for the consideration of refractive surgery, it is important to know why they have chosen to get refractive surgery done and what are the goals of surgery. And once these questions are answered, we'll have a better idea of the type of surgery, distance vision, monovision, and the patient's expectations. It is equally important to note the correct age and proper history regarding frequent change of glasses should be noted. Obtaining a thorough medical and ocular history is important to look for diseases that potentially can affect the outcome of the surgery. Systemic diseases such as diabetes, autoimmune diseases, collagen vascular diseases may alter wound healing, and conditions such as ocular herpes or peripheral keratitis may cause reactivation after the LASIK surgery. And patients with history of strabismus surgery may also experience a recurrence of squint after the surgery. Thorough list of medication history is important because medications such as migraine drug sumatriptan and tretinoin, which is used to treat severe acne, may result in ocular surface drying. And it is also important to know past surgical history. Important to rule out certain syndromes that are associated with high refractive errors like Marfan syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos, Alport, Weil-Marchesani, and Strickler, which all cause myopia. And it is also important to rule out uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. Preoperative visual acuity assessment is very important. It is important to note monocular as well as binocular vision. Near vision should be noted. Please rule out amblyopia. Note ocular dominance. And it is preferable to use Logmar chart over Snellen's chart to help reduce certain limitations. Equally important to evaluate ocular surface disorders. Please do Shermer test. You can do OSDI questionnaire also to evaluate if there is presence of any ocular surface disorders. Otherwise, patient after keratorefractive surgery is going to have a lot of problems and will be an unsatisfied patient after the surgery. The visual outcome of refractive surgery can be assessed in terms of visual performance, not only visual acuity, but also contrast sensitivity, depth of focus, and the ablative procedure cause changes in the stroma and Bowman's layer, which can cause wavefront aberrations. And these wavefront aberrations should be estimated, because after your refractive surgery, refractive correction, although the refractive errors may be reduced, but higher order aberrations like trefoil, coma, and spherical aberration may be induced. Slit lamp examination is a must to do thorough and corneal examination, rule out endothelial dystrophy. Please also look into the lens and find if you are missing any crystalline lens changes. Look for dysfunctional lens, look for any nuclear sclerosis changes. There can be errors in keratometry and topography. If improper topography assessment is done, there can be error in autokeratometry or pachymetry. If by mistake you have used old keratometric values, and if keratometry and topography has not been done by the operating surgeon. So to make keratometry as accurate and consistent as possible, we must the one person should do all these assessments, and preferably on a single instrument, because all these instruments like autokeratometers, manual keratometers, topographers, they estimate different zones, different areas, and by different methods. For example, auto K measures central 2.5 millimeter zone, whereas manual keratometry measures estimates a larger 3.2 millimeter zone, and simulated keratometry employs a different method altogether. It is equally important to calibrate your instruments and keep a log of these evaluations. And recent versions of the softwares require the user to confirm the accuracy of the instrument against a calibration test block at the beginning of each day. Validation is very important. Second check should be done in case you have keratometry less than 40 or more than 48 diopters. If the difference between the K of two eyes is more than 1.5 diopters, K1 and K2 difference is more than 3 diopters, and if there is difficulty in obtaining the readings. Preoperative optic nerve assessment is important to rule out any evidence of glaucomatous optic neuropathy or disc pallor, and also look into the periphery, do indirect ophthalmoscopy to find out any degeneration required in treatment. So it is very important to counsel the patient. You can tell the patient that the post-operative period, the vision may remain blurry for some period of time. Equally important to inform the patient regarding proper eye hygiene, and particularly not to rub the eyes, as a flap displacement can occur. Patient should also be advised not to play any strenuous contact sports, and patient should be made aware of glare, halos, and difficulty in driving. Proper patient counseling, and most important is to for us to do proper cycloplegic refraction, because that is the crux of my talk. I'll give one example here. A patient, this patient example I have borrowed from Dr. Piyush Kapoor, a patient who had undergone pre-operative myopic LASIK, as she was wearing about -2.5 diopters of spectacle correction. But she was not satisfied. And ultimately, she landed up at a place where, unfortunately, depending on the manifest refraction, the myopic laser correction was done. And patient, after the surgery, was also not satisfied. And then the thorough examination, thorough evaluation was done, cycloplegic refraction was done. And lo and behold, what we found was that the patient was having 7 diopters of hypermetropia. So what could have been gone wrong in this case? Probably patient was having the accommodation spasm, and because of that, this mildly hyperopic patient was accepting myopic glasses. And what happened was that now we are faced with a situation where 7 diopters of hypermetropic correction is there, and we have given patient 1 diopter, and after fogging, we are giving patient to hope that 2.5 diopter has been accepted. And let's see, we can slowly increase the hyperopic refraction correction in this patient later on. Thank you, everybody, for your kind and patient hearing.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Bhalla. That was a wonderful talk. Just one small question. What drug do you use to dilate all these patients? And is there any specific, do you do a complete cycloplegia like only with Tropicamide plus, or do you use cyclomide, Bomide, any of these drugs, any special preference?
See, in younger patients, I like to do with a proper cycloplegia, like homatropin 2% is the drug of my choice.
Okay.
And close to the presbyopic age, say after 25 to 30 years of age, I do with the even tropicamide or the thing tropicamide phenylephrine combination can be used. But it is important that in wherever you suspect hyperopia or in younger patient, proper cycloplegia correction evaluation is a must. Homatropin 2% is the drug of my choice.
Definitely. That is a very beautiful talk, because as LASIK surgeons, we have faced this problem so many times. Because LASIK is a group practice, and there are surgeons and there are people who would want the same surgery on the same day without dilatation. The patients also sometimes want, no, I don't want dilatation. So we should insist on a proper dilatation. That should be the take-home message. Please don't operate any patient before doing a proper cycloplegic refraction. Otherwise, you can land up in trouble, like Dr. Bhalla has shared a very wonderful case. And I'm thankful to him for giving this take-home message. Anybody else from the panel, Dr. Jaya, Dr. Piyush, any other questions to sir? Otherwise, we can move on to the next lecture. Dr. Ashish has also joined in. I think Dr. Gaurav will join in later. So any questions?
I think we can go on for the next talk.
Okay. So I would now invite Dr. Piyush Kapoor, and who is the director of the Healing Touch Eye Center, and he is the main source, main inspiration for this center, doing thousands of LASIK surgery in the past 15 years of our practice together. We have done more than 15,000 eyes, and I am thankful for him and the whole team at the Healing Touch Eye Center. And with Dr. Jaya's support, we are now doing all kinds of difficult refractive surgeries, all kinds of tricky situations we are also doing. Thanks to her, she is a cornea specialist. And now I would invite Dr. Piyush Kapoor from the Healing Touch Eye Center, New Delhi, to start his talk. Did I choose the right procedure? LASIK versus surface ablation. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Neeraj, for giving me an opportunity to talk on this topic. In fact, after having talked about the LASIK, we are moving step ahead, done the refraction, and now we need to choose the right procedure. About a minute back, I was just addressing a patient who had come for an ICL surgery, and the parent of the patient was a little too apprehensive, and I just told a single sentence that don't worry, even if anything goes wrong, the beauty of the procedure is that it's a reversible procedure. But whenever we are dealing with a keratorefractive surgery, the main thing we need to understand is that it is not a reversible procedure. Once done, it is done forever. And the decision before you fly is the main crux for your success. So you need to be very specific that what procedure and what surgery you are choosing for your patient. Before I answer the title question, I would like to ask ourselves another group of questions, my friend. Why are the surgeons reversing their attitude from LASIK towards a PRK? The choice is changing. Is PRK more safe because of no flap being there, less chances of ectasia, less thinning with a thicker residual bed, and the ease of choosing the procedure even in suspicious corneas, and no effect on the posterior segment with less of dry eye? So the answer for all these was yes. But why then a great evolution occurred from PRK in the excimer laser surgeries going on to LASIK? It is because I would say none of the procedures is very safe and which is not associated with problems. And PRK is also the same. It is also associated with its own problems. And the main problem exists is of haze. Haze can be early and late, which can be due to an early removal of contact lens in the bad healing or the bad surface of the cornea, more of UVA exposure, and high corrective paths. So we need to limit ourselves in these. An improper decision was taken, and that is why we learned from our mistake in this case, was a case where a surgery was done, a perfect surgery was done, but still the cornea was scarred. And the scar was a little too much to affect the vision of the patient. But when we went back and took the history, we saw that the patient had a history of keloid formation. So we need to choose the right patient for the right procedure, and any surgery of refractive surgery in general should be avoided in a patient with keloid history. This is another example of a patient in which a LASIK surgery was done. The patient had a regression because a high power was treated. And as per our decision, we tend to correct the refractive or the regression, thinking of epithelial hyperplasia being the main cause. And we did a surface ablation for this patient. To our surprise, it was our first experience of treating a patient with a surface ablation, and we found this. And maybe my experience with my own one patient was so bad that I didn't have the capacity to go further. And I would like to ask the expert panelists that do you feel that the surface ablation in the treatment of LASIK is safe doing it over the flap, or one should avoid? Maybe in the end, we can have an experience or a suggestion from all of you. Still, the problems are beyond the haze. So there are problems of persistent epithelial defect. There are chances of infection. Regression of refraction is a common scenario, which is generally seen in the first 1 year only and does not go on further. Slow rehabilitation is another issue because the patient will keep nagging your head for almost about 6 weeks for a vision to be restored to a satisfactory level of a 6/6 or a 6/5. And scarring, of course, is an issue. So what to choose from, LASIK or a PRK? Well, here is a comparative list which says that surface ablation's main issues are of haze and infection. And if I say that if we are able to eliminate these from our scope, then I believe surface ablation would be the choice in my, according to me. So if we see that that PRK got an FDA approval in 1995, over the journey of Excimer, we found that LASIK picked up in between, and still now we are coming back to what is called as advanced surface ablation. I would use the word advanced surface ablation because now with a slight modification in PRK, by using mitomycin C, doing epi-LASIK, LASIK, or the latest in our kitty is the transepithelial PRK, I feel that we are in a much safer zone, and advanced surface ablation is the answer to our problems. So when we talk of advanced surface ablation, I would say that we are able to give a better quality of vision to our patients. We reduce their post-operative pain and minimize the chance of corneal haze. I would say that in my practice of refractive surgery, almost I have gone to the level of about 40 to 50% of my patients I am advising a surface ablation, because the confidence has gone so high that I feel very comfortable doing a surface ablation. I don't have the issues of ectasia nagging my head. I don't have the issues of flap causing any visual disturbance in my head. And my patients are better satisfied if I explain them and counsel them well. Even when I looked into the literature before making that talk, I found many of the papers which all suggested that biomechanical strength after a PRK was much better as compared to the LASIK. Even when we were comparing any surgery, may it be SMILE, may it be femto-LASIK, anything was always better. And one of the papers even said that the vision after 7 years of a LASIK did not give a stable refraction, whereas in PRK, whatever the changes were in the first year and after a year, all the patients had a stable refraction. Though coma was an issue in both. So whenever we have a borderline cornea, my friend, or a thin cornea with a suspected topography of these all issues, my choice always remains a surface ablation. But yes, I limit my surface ablation to a spherical equivalent to -6, which was my initial benchmark. But now I have shifted to almost about an 8 or 8.5 diopter of spherical correction. So here's an example of choosing the right procedure. This was a patient which we encountered just in the recent past. And as Dr. Neeraj was saying, accidentally, we didn't actually analyze the topography very deeply. And in the topography, only one eye had an inferior steepening of a slightly steeper K values of 42 in the inferior zone, 44.2 as compared to the 42.7 in the superior zone in the right eye, and the left eye topography was normal. The surgeon from our center chose to do a LASIK, and 7 years down the line, the patient came, 6 years down the line, the patient came with this picture to us. it was a frank ectasia. Luckily, when we just try to go back, we could actually see our mistake. And this is what I say now, what I should not have done. Maybe a PRK was a better choice in this patient when we had a suspicion. We tend to overlook, or maybe because of some pressure on the surgeon just went on, which should not have been done. Or rather, I would say, if we had a better tool to analyze as compared to the TMS5 initially we had, maybe if a pentacam was done, maybe this was the patient for no intervention at all. So there are other specific indications for PRK as well. There are patients who are involved into various sports activity, or they have retina issues where extensive laser barrage has been previously done. I believe these are also the right candidates to do a PRK rather than doing a LASIK and giving them a flap. So this was another hockey player who came with an injury after the LASIK, and the flap was displaced, though the patient reached in time and the flap was very well reposted back, and the visual outcome was perfectly normal after that. But every patient may not be lucky. This patient had a LASIK done elsewhere. She had an injury, went to another ophthalmologist, and a pad and bandage was done over the injury with a central epithelial defect. And she landed up to us with this kind of a epithelial ingrowth. We did try to lift the flap, do the cleaning, but still some haze was left because the ingrowth was quite dense. And then YAG laser was done over it and the defect disappeared. So these are the general issues with the patient when an injury occurs over the flap. So wherever we suspect any kind of a trauma which the patient may encounter in their day because of their occupation or their day-to-day activity, I believe LASIK is the choice for it. This is another example of taking up a patient with a very high refractive error, treating a minus 9.5, as I found that the cornea was very thick and good, though the AC depth was fine. And we went and did a LASIK. Just about 5 months later, the patient is coming to us with a refraction of this. And I think we put our diagnosis on regression for this. We are still waiting and ask the patient to wait and see. The next question comes to my mind is whether we are dealing with regression or ectasia. And again, the same thing, what I should not have done. Could an ICL be a better choice in this patient? I would just sum up by saying that PRK is a good alternative to LASIK as regards to the safety and the corneal stability. However, it carries some problems, especially the haze and epithelial healing, which are much less with the today's scenario of advanced surface ablation. And of course, LASIK is better in the straightforward cases, but we only follow ultra thin flaps of 90 microns. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piyush. It was a wonderful talk and supported by so many practical examples. And I think the right message has gone to whoever is watching this instruction course. I would like some comments from Dr. Jaya, who's a cornea specialist, and Dr. Ashish Nagpal on Piyush's talk, and what choice do they have in case they have this dilemma of PRK versus LASIK. Dr. Ashish, you are there, so just a single comment from you. Dr. Ashish, maybe now Dr. Jaya can answer the same question, that whenever there is a dilemma between a PRK and LASIK, especially what kind of surgery would you like to perform, or you would advise the patient not at all to go for the surgery and maybe do a ICL? So
I would prefer. Dr. Ashish has now joined. Let him speak first.
Dr. Ashish, your call. I was asking if there is a choice between when we are in doubt whether to do a LASIK, whether to do a PRK, because your choice is you are doing a topic on ICL also. So would you, in the present scenario, do either LASIK or PRK, because LASIK is not good for the patient. So maybe that is why we are doing PRK. Now the third question comes, if this dilemma comes, do we switch on to a ICL, especially with the lower powers, if the power is -2, -3? So your comments on that. Your talk is also on ICL, or just
I think we can just ask him directly that till what diopters are you actually taking up LASIK and PRK, and what are your limits for the keratorefractive surgery?
Yeah, that's it, Dr. Ashish.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think I would go with what Dr. Piyush's criteria is. Like earlier, we used to limit ourselves to around 6.5 to around 60 microns of the ablation. But now with the use of mitomycin C, also we have not gone beyond that. So that is what would be the thumb rule, so to say.
And Ashish, are you doing this surface ablation on a LASIK flap? Because as I shared one of my cases, my experience was really bad in that, and the patient landed up with a scar. So for regression as such, when you have a normal cornea, and what is your experience with doing a surface ablation on these LASIK flaps?
I think we've done very few, maybe one or two odd, and I think we didn't have any untoward experience as such. We tend to use mitomycin C for all our patients, and they were limited to around 1.5 or so. I think not more than that.
I have to share the same experience.
How much was it?
In our case, also it was about a 2.5 in one eye and 1.75 in the other eye.
I have to share the same experience with Piyush. I also did one case, but luckily that case did not face any, and we use mitomycin C, that is sure. So I have done one case of this, what you call touch-up LASIK, or that is called PRK over the previous LASIK flap, and thankfully the patient did not suffer from any problem. So I think we can carry on the discussion forward.
I can add one thing probably, that probably in Dr. Piyush's case, if it was a thin flap, like we were augmenting on a 90 micron flap. So can that be a variable for having the scar? Because the previous papers have been described with a more thicker flap on which they have done the PRK augmentation.
That could be one of the factors, and I don't know whether it is reported in literature or not, because cases are very few and select. But I have seen certain articles where they are constantly doing PRK over this LASIK flaps, and even recently I have read some articles, and they are not facing any problems. So I think mitomycin C is the answer for this. Don't do it retouch without a mitomycin C. That is most important. So I think we can carry on the discussion later also if we have time. I would now like to invite Dr. Jaya Gupta, and her talk would be on microkeratome failures. Dr. Jaya Gupta is the academic in charge of our center, the Healing Touch Eye Center, and she is the brain behind editing all the beautiful, wonderful courses, instruction courses that have come up. Dr. Piyush is you can say maybe the source of the inspiration, and Dr. Jaya helps in editing and doing the final touch-up, and all this presentation is thanks to her and her colleagues, friends. And I would like to invite her again to talk on microkeratome failures. Dr. Jaya, please.
Okay, thank you, sir. That's very kind of you. So without wasting time, I'll start my screen share. So I'll be talking about microkeratome failures. It's not a didactic compilation of the complications, but a few lessons learned in my journey over here with the SPK microkeratome. So our center started with the refractive services in 2010. I joined the center in 2012, and as of date, we've done close to 15,000 eyes. And with different procedures that we've been doing include surface ablation, SPK 90 micron LASIK, the blade-free femto LASIK, and the much hyped and talked about Contura LASIK that we also do. So armamentarium includes the Alligator Wavelight EX500, and we use for our blade procedures the SPK microkeratome 90 and the 130 head. For bladeless LASIK, we were using Z6, but off late we are now using the AMO Intralase. So do we need to discuss the microkeratome complications? Yes, indeed. Why? Because microkeratomes, it's because of the prohibitive cost of the femtosecond platform, or from surgeons not actually being convinced that there are more complications with the microkeratome and that the femtosecond laser offers a true advantage. So what were the complications this particular paper enumerated was failure to achieve appropriate intraocular pressure, partial flaps, buttonholes, thin or irregular flaps, free flaps. With the Hansetome, it was 0.16%. With the automated corneal shaper, it was 6.38%. And the total complication rate reported was 0.302% of the 28,000 cases analyzed. The risk factors were plates from different manufacturers giving us inconsistent flap thickness. A more thinner flap, less than 100 micron, was associated with epithelial defects rather than with 130 microns, and disposable heads posed less risk. Besides, increasing patient age greater than 40 years, preoperative hyperopia, years of contact lens wear were the other risk factors. Flatter corneas tend to have free caps and incomplete flaps, whereas the steeper corneas, they reported to have epithelial abrasions, thin or irregular flaps, and with narrow palpebral fissures because of insufficient fixation of the microkeratome, there were additional risk factors. So though Dr. Baraka has been associated with the innovation of microkeratome, it was Dr. Ioannis Palikaris who has been credited with the creation of corneal hinge and doing a photoablation underneath. And the different microkeratome options available were and are Hansetome, Xioptix XP microkeratome, the Amadeus 2 from AMO, MK2000 from Nidec, then the M2 from Moria. What we use is SPK from Moria, and then we also have the Corezo pendular microkeratome from Schwen. Quickly going into the components of the microkeratome, first of all, we have the console, which provides the vacuum. Then we have the body or the motor, which is connected to the head or the blade. And then we have different suction rings. So the SPK microkeratome from Moria, it creates a nasal hinge, and we have two heads, 90 and 130. What we encountered were epithelial defects, neovascular bleeding, thin flap, free flap, incomplete flap, tone irregular flap, and decentered flap. This is a very honest review, and the complications, I'll say that barely with each of them, hardly one or two cases of all. I'll be telling something about this striae, though it's not a microkeratome failure, and corneal perforation as reported in different papers, none. So coming on to the first lesson, that's of an epithelial complication. This was a 27-year male with a refractive error of -6.25 and -0.75 in the right eye, and -5.5 and -0.75 in this in the left eye, with a steep K values, 46, 47 in the right and 46, 47 in the left eye. He was scheduled for wavefront optimized LASIK in August. After I finished off the first eye, I noticed some rippling of epithelium, central rippling of epithelium in the first eye, some loose epithelium, which I deposited and placed a BCL. In the second eye, again, prior to start of surgery, I noticed some loose epithelium, sort of loose epithelium, but that didn't deter me. I went ahead with the surgery. But as I started with my surgery, there was the flap did not happen, and very faintly, this is a post-op picture, day 5. You can see over here that the flap was not complete, and it was, you can see just a faint line over here that this was the edge. This was the only area which was cut, and this entire area remained uncut. A month later, we can see over here, just a second. A month later, the patient had some amount of scarring in the left eye, and he had an AR value of -9 with -5.25 and a refraction of -4.75 with -2.5 cylinder, improving to 6.6 parts. My slide is not moving. My slide is not moving. Okay. 3 months down the lane, this is his refraction with -4.5 and -3.25 cylinder. And we notice a central haze in the right eye, and in the left eye, we can see once again the edge of the previous flap, which was like this, and the remaining rest of the area, which was not cut. So we take him for streamlined PRK and he gets an uncorrected vision of 6 paths. There's some issue. So epithelial complications during the MK pass, the epithelial layer may shift. Intraoperative epithelial defects, they prolong visual recovery. They cause more of post-op pain, may predispose to diffuse lamellar keratitis, epithelial ingrowth. The risk factors for it include people having map dot fingerprint dystrophy, older than 40 years, loose or torn epithelium. And here we also learned the value of one drop LASIK, that is no preoperative drops are put in the eye prior to LASIK to minimize toxic keratopathy that greatly increases the risk of epithelial defects. Topical anesthesia should be minimized, including length of time between application of anesthetic agent and creation of microkeratome cut. The management varies according to the size of tear and its location. Mostly, if possible, reposition and bandage contact lens till epithelial defect well sealed and covered. The second thing that I'll be discussing about is neovascular bleeding, which we often encounter in these patients because they are prolonged contact lens users. Though with SPK, it's mostly the superior arcade which gets cut. And the superior bleeding that is easily, we can tamponade it. So microkeratome cutting to vessels in superior or inferior panels, particularly if neovascularization following contact lens wear. In such a scenario, the flap is not to be lifted immediately. We take a dry Merocel sponge, position it carefully to absorb the blood, or we can leave the suction ring in place with downward pressure, tamponading the bleeding vessels. The blood should not be allowed to accumulate on the bed because of the possibility of differential hydration of the stromal bed that may result in differential ablation depths. The flap is repositioned after ablation, irrigation performed, followed by expression of fluid out from the interface. The next most important thing is the free flap, because this is what sometimes with SPK, a lot of people do encounter. Now, this particular 18-year male with a refractive error, which is getting with a refractive error of -0.25 and -2.5 in the right eye, his keratometry values were 40 and 42, and the corneal size that we see over here was 12.9. In this particular case, I chose to take an SPK ring of 0 with 8, and there I land with a free flap in this patient. So in the other eye, it was modified and we took ring 1 with 7.5, which was okay. So when the microkeratome does not stop to create a hinge, but continues across the cornea, severing the flap from the bed, then we land with a free flap. Mostly earlier it was reported with flat corneas, but now with steep cornea too, with SPK, because of wrong selection of the ring and stop and the corneal diameter, we can land in free flap. Also, if it's a very thin flap due to inadequate pressure, the flap would be smaller, more central in cornea with an irregular edge. The management consists of, once we have identified, remove the flap from the microkeratome head, carefully place it epithelial side down on a drop of BSS, continue with the operation, and the flap is replaced and aligned with the help of, I'll quickly go to the next incomplete pass. Again, sir, do I have time? Can I just do these things?
You can continue for a couple of minutes, 2 more minutes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So incomplete pass, this was a LASIK aborted elsewhere. We can see the flap edge over here. It's a funnel-shaped flap, the hinge stopping in between, midway. So for this, again, we did a surface ablation. So incomplete pass mostly happens due to mechanical interference by lid speculum drapes, improper assembly of cleaning, and more than tolerable friction in the pass of microkeratome through the suction ring stops. If the edge of the planned ablation is near the edge of planned ablation, the hinge is protected and continue. But if it stops midway, then we stop it and plan the procedure again. With thin flaps and buttonholes, I leave this, but I'll just come to a lack of time. I'll just come to my last photograph that I wanted to share, because this flap striae, Dr. Piyush has already referred. I'll just bring your, I'd like to talk about these micro striae. There was a patient post-op who was unhappy with his vision, and even on retro illumination, or we could not capture the micro striae. But this was a picture that I captured on my automated refractometer, where we can see these fine microstriae, and we can see that his refraction, he had no refraction. I mean, there was no AR values. This patient was taken up for flap wash, and this is how the AR looked later on. So here I'll just tell about the tenting effect of corneal flap over ablated stromal bed, commonly after large ablations. And I particularly feel that if it's a thin flap and if we are doing a large ablation, the tenting effect happens more, and we tend to see more of these microstriae. So I'll end over here, because I just thought, since we were enumerating the complications, issues with the microkeratome, and the issues are practically none, but these were some of the interesting things that actually came in my mind. So I just thought of putting up this line. So with this, I end. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaya. That was a very interesting talk. Dr. Gaurav has joined us in between his busy schedule, and I would like to welcome him on the board. And just to let you know, Ashish is facing a little bit of internet problem, but I think he has sorted it out. So Ashish will be taking the next talk. But before we go on, Dr. Gaurav, I have one specific question for you. Like Dr. Piyush has already said, these microkeratome failures are things more of the past, because people are now changing more towards PRK, or maybe people are moving on to the newer kind of surgeries like the femto cataracts, the femto surgeries, or the smile surgeries. So Dr. Gaurav is going to talk about smile surgeries, and I would like to understand from Sir Dr. Gaurav also whether you are having flap related issues in the smile. I think you may be talking about it. So let us move on, because Dr. Gaurav has a very limited time. We can do a discussion on the microkeratome failures later. So I would invite Dr. Gaurav Luthra to talk on when femtosecond or smile may not be the best option.
Thanks, so, Neeraj. Thank you so much. You can have that question now. I'll be happy to participate if everybody else is, wanting to talk.
Okay. So if you are no. So the main question
for 10 minutes at least. Yes.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. So main question was that in case Dr. Piyush has already said that he's shifting, you were not there before, he's saying he's shifting more towards PRK. And as I understand, in your practice, you have shifted from PRK to other more advanced surgeries like a femto laser, or maybe even a smile laser. So do you really think that microkeratome is on its way out, or does it still have a very big chunk left still in the future practice? What are your views about it? Because you are more into the future thing. So what do you think about it?
So, Neeraj, in my practice, actually, microkeratome is now less than 10% or even less. I think we hardly do microkeratome, because most of those actually will get converted to PRK, if at all. Otherwise, it's mostly femto LASIK and Contura and smile. But that's probably because the profile of our patients has changed over the years. Once you buy a smile and you start having those segments of 1 lakh plus, the low-end patients, somehow, even if they want, they will not come to you. They'll prefer to go elsewhere and get operated with microkeratome. So that's a big loss. It's, actually, I would not mind doing more of microkeratome patients, but somehow they don't reach us. So microkeratome still has a great role. I'm not saying that because in my practice it's gone down. It still has a big role. There is no doubt that microkeratome is, for the cost, price-conscious market, it definitely has a good role. It has a good safety profile when used correctly. I mean, the modern microkeratomes like SBK and all, I'm very happy to use them where I have to use them, and I will not hesitate to use them. But I have not gone away from PRK at all. In fact, my PRK volumes went up in the last 2-3 years. We are doing more of PRK, especially with the AccuVeil assisted. The pain element is almost gone completely. So now I don't even tell patients, and I don't counsel them that they're going to have any extra pain or any discomfort. All I counsel them is that it'll take you a week or so, or 2 weeks to for good visual recovery. So if you have time, but the pain element is 90% taken care of now. So PRK has actually increased, and with trans PRK, I think we are doing even bigger numbers, as much as might you be doing probably. Trans with the both the platforms, the Schwind and the Wavelight, have good trans PRK options. So microkeratome has a place for sure, but maybe a limited space. And I now don't like to make flaps at all, whether microkeratome or femto. I would probably want to do smile, but then price is always a problem. And if possible, I would avoid flaps completely.
Okay. So any comments from Dr. Piyush, Dr. Jaya, any questions? Dr. Ashish, Dr. Bhalla is also there. Any comments also, or any questions? So.
No, I think
sir, I also, Ashish, please.
Ashish.
Yeah.
Continue, Ashish. Ashish, your question.
Continue, Ashish. Yeah.
No, I was just reiterating that with the trans-PRK, it's so much simpler for everybody, the patient, the surgeon, and it's just a matter of 2-3 days. It's a little post-op delayed healing. That's all. Otherwise, given a choice, that becomes a very easy option and safer too.
Cornea surgeons always believe in doing surface ablation. This is what I've learned over the years.
No, but actually, I believe time teaches you, and that gives you more of mental peace by doing a PRK. Of course, I was also saying that in my practice, almost 50% of my patients I'm counseling for a PRK. I don't have an access to SMILE, of course, but whatever keratofractive surgeries, PRK has become my first choice after trans PRK.
Any comments, Dr. Jaya, before we move on to Dr. Gaurav?
I'll say that with the literate patients, it's very easy to counsel them for PRK, but with the understanding being poor, it's very difficult to counsel them for surface ablation.
You should not counsel them specially for surface ablation. That's what I've learned. I don't tell them that I'm going to do something different. It's like topical cataract surgery or topical phaco. You don't tell them that I'm going to do topical for you because now you naturally do topical. You don't tell them that I'm not going to give you an injection. Okay, same way for surface ablations.
That tells about the confidence in the results. If we are confident about the results, we'll be telling more about it. So that's
the only thing you have to tell them. See, I typically tell them that each procedure has its peculiarities. In LASIK, you will not be allowed to rub your eyes for a week. In PRK, I will ask you to have a contact lens in place for a week. And, in SMILE, it will be different. So I tell them the precautions, basic precautions, but I don't hype the complications or precautions or the difficulties of PRK over LASIK or SMILE. In fact, I tell them this is the safest procedure. And if given a choice, I would be doing this for all my patients if they had enough time to kind of rest and recover for 5-6 days. So then that clinches it. They never tell me, even the most educated ones or the most illiterate ones, they just want that the procedure should be the safest, and you're not wrong in saying that, I think.
And sir, one more question which had just been talked about is, what is the higher limit of your PRK in your experience? Because you are talking
so my limit is not very high, actually. I don't like to go across 100 microns ever. In fact, I don't even like come close to 100 microns of ablation. I would limit at maximum 70-80 microns.
That means not more than 6 or 7. Not more than 6
or 7. Not more than that. The highest I've done is 9, but I would not go beyond 6 or 7. Now, LVP with its mitomycin protocols of, per diopter, they are using 10 seconds. They are doing 10, 11, 12 diopters, and Praveen Krishna is doing like more than 10 diopters routinely.
He's a total PRK surgeon.
So they have amazing results with PRK. I have very good results. I don't see haze. I don't have problems, but I somehow have that mental block that I will not go beyond. Frankly, now we don't do high corrections even with LASIK and SMILE beyond 8 or 9. I would switch to ICL if possible. So I think
and you are using alcohol mainly, or you are doing the...
No, so last 10 years I'm using an Amoyals brush. And other than that, I stopped using alcohol almost 10-12 years back. I use a brush or I use trans-PRK.
Okay. So any comments, any questions from Dr. Bhalla before we move on to Dr. Gaurav's talk? Sir, you are there. So I think we will move on to the next talk, Dr. Gaurav Luthra himself, when femtosecond and SMILE may not be the best option. Sir, over to you.
Thanks, Neeraj. I've tried to put something together and you'll have to excuse me. I would have done much better had I had time. But
no, sir, that's somehow, fine. That's fine. You have to just share your experience and we'll be very happy.
Yeah, I'll do that. Oh, where has it gone? One moment. I don't see the presentation. Please give me a moment. Okay. I'm so sorry. In a moment it disappeared when I tried to look for it. Okay, here it is. I hope this is the right one. Yeah. Okay, so we've already gone through, like, you have so many options now, and this is not even a complete list of what all we can do. And Contura and SMILE seem to be the things that patients mostly come and ask you for when they have searched the net. In fact, everybody searches the net today. They'll either ask you for one of these or something special that they've read up, and you have to be prepared to answer all their questions. And however, selecting the right procedure, I think, depends on a lot of things. Availability of equipments in your clinic. You may not have all of them. You may have a few of them. You may have access to a few of them. And and in that sense. Then the surgeon preferences would obviously, like we just saw, different surgeons would have different preferences and comfort zones. Patient preferences may be different. And then the patient parameters and indications. So it's all about case selection, surgeon selection, equipment selection, and the equipment availability can be a big problem. It can be a shared facility or it can be a self-owned. You may have an excimer, microkeratome, femtosecond laser, smile, and you can phakic lenses are becoming more and more popular. So surgeon preferences can depend on these things, convictions, things that you may have a mental block for, peer influence. Even the industry influence makes a lot of difference today, and we all get confused when industry tries to promote a procedure which may not actually be something amazing. Now, country specific, if you would know that places like Japan have completely stopped doing LASIK in the last few years because there was some big problem with LASIK over there. So it's totally gone away from LASIK and they are doing mostly phakic lenses. So in India, when we had that issue about 20 years back, where suddenly there was that RPC report about Indian eyes not being suitable, suddenly the LASIK was gone, and it can be country specific where things change. Patient preferences can be different. They may have different expectations from the procedure, their occupation and their profession and their interests. And then, what they read up on Google is so difficult, because they come back with all information which has been fed to them through Dr. Google. And so now case selection, I think, is the key. And there is no one procedure which is perfect for every patient. Every procedure has its indications and limitations. And I think choosing the right procedure for a patient based on his evaluation, his requirements, his expectations, and his budget is a surgeon's biggest responsibility. So we cannot push something, on the patient. We have to look at him, what he really needs and what is he kind of, going to get out of it. So I think that can so many times change what you thought you were going to do. And once you talk to the patient, it's very important to take a decision on what might actually best suit that person. We all know about these things, so I won't go into that. Now, range of corrections, we were just speaking about it, and my thoughts on these keep changing. As Neeraj just asked me, that I still do surface ablations up to 6 or 7 diopters. 100 microns is my cutoff. And SMILE has become the predominant procedure in my clinic. Possibly again speaks about how much confidence you have with your procedure, and also once you buy a machine, you want to use it, but more important than that, also what you see is good for the patient and what you have more conviction about. So while it's possible for big corrections up till -12, spherical equivalent, and astigmatism up to 5, I think it is best for myopia between 1.5 diopters to -10. I would sometimes not go close to 10. I might, because the lenticule thickness that you remove goes up to almost 150 when you're treating very, very high corrections. I don't like to weaken the cornea that much. Similarly, astigmatism, when I started out, I would probably, be happy doing about 1.5, 2 diopters. Today, I routinely do up to 3 diopters, only when the spherical is much bigger than the astigmatism. Pure astigmatism we've done off late, 3 to 4, 3.5, 4, but there we are very careful about cyclotorsion control, and then we, adjust for that, because that can sometimes not give you the full result. And of course, hyperopia is still not possible. Mixed astigmatism is possible now with the new software upgrade. LASIK is possible for, it has probably the biggest range. LASIK you can do for small 0.5 corrections. You can do it for -12. You can do astigmatism nicely up till -6, and you can do hyperopia up to 6. It's a different matter that now we don't like to do hyperopia up till +6. I used to do hyperopia up till 5 or 6 about 15-20 years back. Today I would be stuck at 2.5, 3 diopters at the most. I would not want to go beyond that. So I think if we quickly look at the pros and cons. PRK, we all understand. I think there's no flap interface complications, best biomechanics in the whole thing, and it's minimally invasive. But then patient discomfort used to be there. Today, I would say that it's hardly there. So that's why my volumes have gone up. The risk of haze has been controlled very well. Requires mitomycin, but also requires good counseling to the patient about topical steroid use and UV protective glasses. And also you have to counsel them a little bit about their slow visual recovery. And SMILE has been my procedure of choice off late. And I would, it definitely has advantages because it preserves the Bowman's and the anterior stroma. So good biomechanics, better than LASIK for sure. I don't know if it's better than surface, but that remains to be proven. Again, it does away mostly with all the flap complications. I always say that on the day of surgery, the patient sleeps well, the surgeon sleeps well. When a patient gets up from the SMILE table right after surgery, I typically have to think what should I tell them, what precautions. There's almost no precaution that they should be taking because, with LASIK, you're typically telling them don't touch your eyes, don't rub your eyes, don't turn in the bed, all these things. With SMILE, you hardly tell them anything. So the optical zones are good. So all these things I think we've gone through in a SMILE talk. I will not talk about them. Minimal precautions. Now, looking at where you should not be doing SMILE. enhancements can be a little bit of a problem, although with new Circle softwares and everything, things have become very easy. Surface enhancements are very easy to do. So we've done a lot with enhancements, and even smile enhancements are coming up. The big thing is customized treatments are not yet possible. So if any patient needs that, and I'll come to that later, hyperopia is still not possible, although the results are showing up well. We don't have cyclotorsion control. It's very expensive. Now, coming to LASIK pros and cons, I think the biggest pro of LASIK, and full range of treatments are possible, and it has an excellent track record, and you can customize in so many different ways, and easy access to surgeons. Every city has good LASIK machines. It's much cheaper. Now, coming to what Neeraj wanted me to speak about, specifically about femto-LASIK and smile contraindications, or where you would not want to do it. So I had to look back and see whether microkeratome versus femto, what all would be good. I think femto is much better than microkeratome in many ways, but amongst them is the planar flap, which allows you to have a flap which is not meniscus shaped as it would happen in microkeratome. And if you're trying to cut a very thin flap with microkeratome, and because it's meniscus, you may get a small buttonhole or Bowman's island in the center. The side cuts make the 90-degree side cuts on the femto flaps make them fit much better. There's much less risk of epithelial ingrowths, much less risk of slippage, and customizations are much more better possible with femto LASIK. And you can customize the flaps in many ways. And then you avoid all these complications with the free flaps. So when you're doing decision-making in the OPD, you would, excuse me for a moment. So I'm sorry. Decision-making, I think most important is to talk to the patient if you're deciding on which procedure to do. And I already spoke about why you should be talking to them. You should learn their expectations, their profession, and their need for surgery. There are so many people I would refuse a surgery when you wanted to do, offer a patient a surgery. You thought that you're going to operate the patient. Patient comes fully prepared to your center that he wants to get operated. And when you talk to them, you realize that, this patient probably would do best. He's probably had a change in refraction, or he's had a change in, there are times when a patient will walk in when he turns 18 with his father that I had my birthday recently and I would like to get operated. I would typically tell them, unless you're doing a merchant navy or something which necessitates you to do a procedure right now, I would ask you to wait, because, you may have changes in refraction, you may have changes in your topography, you may have, a cornea which may be going into a suspect cornea. I typically try to postpone them till the age of 21 and keep seeing them every year. So that's again a responsibility. And now looking at contraindications, now there are times when, you will start looking at patients, and while, it might appear to you that these patients are really good for a procedure, but I would be reluctant. First, obviously, all of us would first look at the topography of the patient. Scheimpflug is probably the way to kind of, get the maximum information, which includes the pachymetry maps, the, surface maps and the elevation maps. And then of course the Belen-Ambrosio displays if you have a pentacam or other maps, on the other machines. But I think, going for, first of all, if I had to do a LASIK or a smile today, I would not do it below 490. So whether be it a femto LASIK or I have gone in the past to 480 and 475. Today, I would definitely not want to go on any procedure below 490 if I have to make a flap or a smile procedure. So my cutoff for smile and LASIK and femto LASIK remains the same. There are no decision criteria which are different for LASIK and smile. I don't allow a thinner bed on smile as I would for LASIK. The criteria would be exactly the same. If I had less than 490, I would start thinking of the surface of an ICL procedure. Now, how thin can you go on the surface? I would not go operate on a cornea which was perfectly healthy in every other way below a 450 or a 460, and that too if I was only doing a smaller ablation. If I have to do a deeper ablation, I would probably avoid doing that. And anything below 470, if everything else looks good for a phakic lens, I would do that. So again, maximum ablation depths are another consideration when you would like to do whether a LASIK or a smile or a surface. So on a PRK, as I said, my maximum of 100 microns. Now LASIK, I typically would cut off at 120 microns, which means that even if I have a 600 cornea and I have to do a -14, I will not want to do it, because, an ablation of more than 120 to 125 microns can be a situation where, you are causing more weakening and the PTA would be disturbed for sure. And similarly on smile, you end up, because you have the protection of a cap, so you may end up going for a little thicker lenticule removals as compared to what you might do with LASIK, but the residual bed will not change. So I might do a 120 or a 130 or a 135 microns, sometimes even a 140 microns lenticule, but I will not allow a residual bed to go down. So PTA criteria has to be same for both LASIK and smile. So this becomes a big limitation when you're thinking about LASIK or smile, and when you would like to switch to a ICL or a PRK, and you would avoid a femtoLASIK or a SMILE. So again, flat and very steep corneas, I would avoid microkeratome flaps, but they are very good for femto flaps. And I still do the eye trace and the epithelium mapping, and these help me decide between these different procedures. Today, because we do a lot of transepithelial PRK, it's become very important to do epithelium mapping. And with the eye trace, of course, or a similar aberrometer that you might have, it again helps, because if you have significant corneal aberrations which you can correct, you might want to switch to a Contura or a different other procedure which might help improve the corneal aberrations as well. So again, now, when will you not make a femto flap and or a SMILE? Definitely when you have a suspect cornea, even if it meets all the other requirements. Here, I would probably want to switch to the surface, or if I wanted, I would switch to a SMILE extra. Sometimes a SMILE extra would be possible in these patients if they meet all the other criteria, but otherwise I would avoid. My threshold for switching to surface or ICL is very low today. I routinely do ICLs or phakic lenses of 2 or 3 diopters as well. If I notice a suspect cornea, I will not hesitate to switch a patient. Now, the reason why this may be happening is because when a patient comes prepared to pay for a SMILE or a femtoLASIK, he's already spending a lakh of rupees. So switching them to an ICL will not really, hit their budget very much. So it becomes much easier to take that choice today. In the past, when we were doing, LASIK at 35 to 40,000 or 50,000 rupees, switching a patient to an ICL at 1,25,000 or 1,50,000 was a bigger jump. So it would be very difficult for them to do that. Now, again, inferior steepening like this, thinner corneas. Now, these are the prime examples where you would not want to do any form of LASIK or SMILE, because these are the patients where you will want to avoid any kind of flap-based procedure or a weakening procedure if you can. Now, age of the patient is another criterion which is very, very important. And I usually typically below 21 years of age, if I have to do a treatment, I will avoid doing a flap or a SMILE-based procedure if possible. So more importantly, a flap, but also SMILE. I would probably try to veer towards the surface. That doesn't mean that I don't do LASIK and SMILE for below 21s. I still do them, but if possible, I would try to postpone it, or I'll tell them to go on for a couple of years on follow-up and see if they have stable topography and stable corrections. Now, over 21, of course, again, if there's any yellow or red flags on the Billion Ambrosio displays or on my epithelium mapping, I don't have a Corvus, but I think that adds to the number of red flags or yellow flags. You would again want to switch to a procedure which does not weaken the cornea, which means you may not want to make a flap. And if maybe you do a SMILE, you do a SMILE extra. And I think, over 25 things become much better and you are much easier. So I think my time is running out, but I'll quickly come to some slides which I wanted to share, the last few slides. For extra procedures, surface is the best. And SMILE extra, yes, possible sometimes. It works quite well in my practice. But LASIK extra, I don't see has much role at all. So if you've made a flap, a femto flap, or whatever you would like, it still doesn't, work out. When to avoid femto-LASIK? Whenever SMILE PRK is possible, I would, avoid a femto-LASIK. Corneal opacities and scars, suspect corneas, medical aspirants, because it leaves the side cut can leave because of the energy, it can leave a mark which is more visible than what you might see even with a microkeratome, and they can get rejected if they are not allowed to have undergone LASIK. So I would probably choose to a surface procedure there. Again, if you're planning enhancements, if there's already a flap in place or something, avoid a femto-LASIK flap. Peripheral corneal vascularization, if you're making a bigger flap, sometimes these bleed a lot and from the edges and they will not heal. I would probably want to switch to SMILE or a surface procedure which does not go to the periphery. And again, very tight sockets, because sometimes you can have suction losses, you can have complications with femto flaps, and even in the VisuMax, sometimes you can have suction loss. And patients who are very apprehensive or uncooperative and squeezy patients, so you can have these risk of vertical breakthroughs and suction breaks and incomplete flaps. I'm sure there is a talk which is covering femto complications. And these can be the reasons why you would want to avoid femto flaps in such patients. One of my patients where, which was peculiar, because as I did the surgery, I saw these funny small marks appear in the flap. I didn't know what was happening until we realized that there was a problem with the machine, because suddenly the calibration had gone off. I had set a 120 flap and the machine cut a 70 micron flap, and there were bubbles all through the cornea, which looked really funny like this. And I had to abort the procedure and, move to the surface. So you have to be calibrating your machines and, making sure that they are not there. Last slide, when not to SMILE. High astigmatisms, I would still probably, go on to a femto-LASIK or a Contura LASIK. if I had to. Significant active cyclotorsions, suspect and thin corneas. Again, I would not want to do SMILE, or maybe I'll do a SMILE extra. Now, patients who cannot fixate, because then they will not be able to center on the green fixation light. And on the right, you can see this patient who's having this loose conjunctiva. So if there is a wet conjunctiva or a loose conjunctiva, it can start creeping into the suction of the VisuMax. And these are the situations where you might want to avoid it. Again, very apprehensive squeezes, and sometimes very small myopic corrections, like, if you want to do below 1.5 diopters, because the lenticule becomes very, very thin. And then, you have a risk of the lenticule fragments being left behind. So I like to, operate SMILE only beyond 1.5 diopters at least. So I think we already know why when we prefer these procedures. I'll come to the last slide now. So to summarize, I think what's most important from Neeraj's course is, let's not have a fixed mindset of that, SMILE is the best. I do 100% SMILE, or I do 100% surface, or I do 100% LASIK. Every procedure is good. They have their own limitations and their indications. Understanding each patient's need is very critical. And as a surgeon, we have that responsibility. And all modalities have a place in a refractive surgeon's armamentarium. And SMILE is gaining on LASIK in a big way, but PRK is still holding on. And with that, I'll stop here. I was sorry for going beyond time.
Oh, so that was a very interesting talk. Any questions from Dr. Piyush, Dr. Jaya? Otherwise, I have a small question. How much per diopter correction is done? For every diopter correction in SMILE, how much of the bed is lost? How much, like we say 10 to 12 microns?
Right. So what happens is, so, this has been a big question. I'll tell you how it works. So when you're doing a very small correction, you have to, if you're doing a very small correction, then obviously, you'll be probably doing just 20 micron or something, right? Suppose you're doing a 2 diopter, you'll do 25 microns. Now, typically, you don't want to make a 25 microns lenticule, because when you dissect it and all, you'll have a problem and complication. So what you do is you add some thickness to the periphery of the flap. So, you can add, say, 10 microns or 15 or 20 or 25 or even 30. So those are plano thicknesses that you're adding to the lenticule to increase. So typically, if I was doing something like a 1.5 diopter, I'll add 30 to it, so that it becomes actually from, say, 15 or 20 microns, it becomes 45 or 50, because those are safer lenticules. So when you're doing very small corrections, you increase the lenticule thickness. So you're removing more lenticule. Although you're correcting, say, 2 diopters, but you're removing much thicker lenticule. Now, as you go on to higher corrections, you can decrease the lenticule thickness. So, your minimum lenticule thickness can be like 10 microns. So suppose you're doing a -8 or something. So you already have like 100 microns from the lenticule, and you're adding only 10 to it. So all the same, I feel that when it comes to very high corrections, as compared to my LASIK thing, SMILE may be borderline doing little more lenticule removal, but then it's leaving behind a cap which is intact, almost 120 microns. Which on LASIK you're going to remove. So I think it more than compensates for it.
Is it a question to Dr. Gaurav, that when you are increasing the thickness of the periphery of the lenticule, are you practically, like just a thought, that are you practically making the cornea a little biomechanically weaker as compared to when you are doing a LASIK in these cases?
The correction is so small, because, if you're removing like 45 microns of a lenticule, in LASIK, you're already making a 120 flap, right? Biomechanically, that cornea.
No, but like mostly LASIK surgeons now are using a 90 micron flap. Like, I believe nobody is making a flap as thick as a 120 micron in most of the cases. So just a thought that whether, like, if we are increasing such a thickness, then when we are doing a LASIK or we are doing a SMILE.
So I think surface would be the safest, but because, you'll only ablate those 30-40 microns, right? But LASIK will, whatever you might do, LASIK will weaken a cornea much more than SMILE, like whatever you are doing. That's the lesson I learned. I also used to have these fixations that, if I'm doing a very small correction, why should I remove 50 microns, or 45 microns when I can just do a 1.5 ablation? But then, I realized that I was making a flap, even if I'm making 90, and then I'm weakening the cornea by 125, or maybe 120. Here, I'm weakening the cornea only by 45 microns, and the cap remains intact, and the Bowman's is intact, and the anterior stroma, which is actually very strong. So I think it's much less invasive when you even do a very small correction. Here, there is a caution that if you do very small corrections, sometimes the visual quality in SMILE is also not that great. So if I'm doing like a 0.75 or 1, there have been patients who have insisted, and I ended up doing a 0.75 or a 1 diopter with SMILE. It takes a long time for it to settle down. So I would switch to LASIK. Even with surface, I've realized if you're doing a 0.5 correction, like, there are patients who are 6'9", and they've come in for a, for a medical clearance, and they want to get surface done, they will take take ages for them to settle down because the epithelium remodeling takes ages. So I prefer femtoLASIK there actually, because if I'm doing a really small correction and I want quick visual rehabilitation, I will immediately switch to femtoLASIK.
I very well agree with you, sir.
So any questions from Ashish? Because we are running out short of time, Ashish, Dr. Bhalla, or otherwise I continue to the next talk. I will shorten my talk to half. Ashish, you have full 10 minutes. So ICL when things go wrong. So Dr. Ashish, you can start your talk because time is limited. Thank you very much, Dr. Gaurav. It was a very interesting talk. So Dr. Ashish, you can start your slide sharing.
So I'll make my talk short. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ashish, sorry, I did not give an introduction because time is a little short. So you can begin. Everybody knows you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll just take a few seconds because this is very special. That we have Dr. Neeraj and Dr. Piyush, both have been my teachers. And I think Dr. Neeraj we have seen him handle so many of our own complications during our residency, and also Dr. Piyush. So we've done so much on how to handle complications. So this is a short, memorable, just a few things which I have experienced while dealing with ICLs. So I'll limit myself. I mean, there are many phakic IOLs, so I'm limiting myself to just the posterior chamber IOLs, which we know as the famous as the STAR ICL, and now we have our Indian counterparts known as the IPCL, the Biotech, and also from Appasamy, I believe. So my experience is limited to mainly the Vision ICL and a few Biotech ICLs. So I've collected a few cases. So this is the first case. So this is the first post-op day of a patient who underwent ICL. So this is a very scary thing to see, especially in an ICL. So what happened is, I'll just show you through the journey. This was a case in which we inadvertently inserted the ICL in the reverse way, and we realized after injecting it, and you can see that the haptic is outside, and so you can make it out over there. It's very easy to make out, I feel, because the whole design is very convex. So it's not something that you can miss, because the iris and all will not go over it or will not constrict over it. So in this situation, what we attempted at that point, this was way back in 2014, we put a lot of visco both behind and in front of the ICL and tried to flip it around, and we were very happy with that we managed to do it. And then the rest of the procedure was fairly routine. We managed to put the haptics back, and the rest went off fine. It was a spherical ICL. So this was one day post-op, and fortunately for us, this was actually the second eye of the patient. We had already done one ICL in the other eye. So fortunately, we could handhold her, and she could also be patient enough, and she cleared up. But of course, there will be some impact of it, and this was purely on the endothelium. And you can see 6 months, you can see there has been some loss, but thankfully, because it was not so high, she's still doing pretty fine. So this is an ideal outcome. So how do we manage it? So I think it's fairly clear nowadays that how to manage. So in case if you have a reverse ICL, I think the key is that we should not do absolutely any manipulations inside the eye. The answer is to explant it. It does not, earlier we used to be concerned that while removing it, we may damage the ICL, but we know now with experience that it is not so friable as it was made out to be. I can reload it. The STAR has a very good injector system which you can reload and re-inject it. So this should be the approach towards it. And in case if this has not happened in your hands, and if it is something the patient has been referred, or you come across a patient who has a reverse ICL, I think what I would do is that I would do the calculations and keep a backup ICL and then do the reimplantation of the same ICL as planned. So this is one aspect of it. This was one case which I had come across. The whole ICL was a little, you can see it's all yellowish. It's almost amber colored ICL. So the patient was very happy. He had just come for a follow-up. He had been operated almost in 2010 somewhere. And he had just come for a routine follow-up, and I noticed this on dilatation. And he had absolutely no visual complaints whatsoever. Both eyes had the similar picture. It was all a yellowish looking lens. And on some research, I kind of figured out that maybe this was, because it was definitely not a star ICL, it was a little more thicker than what we see, as you can also make out. So this was probably one of the initial clinical trials of one of the Indian lenses. Maybe the material at that time was different, or maybe it was just a idiosyncratic reaction to that particular patient's eye. Fortunately, it had no visual impact. This was a case which was referred to us. The patient had undergone a successful ICL surgery, and after a week, he developed some inflammation, and he had some hypopion, the referring surgeon had told us, and they had given some antibiotics, and he had responded, topical antibiotics. But then again, after a week, he came back. So this time, as you can see, there was an hypopion. There was a lot of AC reaction. The fundus was not visible, and you can see there were a lot of exudates inside the vitreous. So this was a case of endophthalmitis, a low-grade endophthalmitis post-ICL. This is also many years ago, and this again. So in this case, Dr. Manish, our retina specialist, he went in and he did a vitrectomy, and they preserved the ICL because there was nothing like a fibrin over the ICL or anything like that, which made us feel that there is some nidus maybe in the ICL per se. And the retina also was fairly okay, of course, a high myope, and the patient fortunately did not have a recurrence. There was nothing, and nothing grew unfortunately in the vitreous tab, so we didn't know which organism caused it. But it was definitely not sterile. So this was one of the cases. So, I mean, if you have such a scenario, I think it's important in this case that one should be a little more aggressive, because usually when you're dealing with ICLs, your own patients, you would be a little reluctant and maybe managing it with intravitreals, but sometimes it's best to go in and do a little bit more aggressive, like with any endophthalmitis, so to say. This, I think, is one of the problems associated, which causes more problem with the toric ICLs. So, and which I think all of us must have faced at some point. So this was one of those cases in which you can see the IOL has shifted. Initially, it was well placed. The patient specifically told us that, you know, he went back on the 5th day. He had good vision, crisp vision, 6/6, and on the 5th day, he had some rubbing. And something went into his eye and he rubbed it, and then his vision has been distorted. But of course, there is, and you can also see that, although I do not have the OCT of that time, but you can make out that the vault is on the lower side. It's not a very high vault. So what needs to be understood in this scenario is two things. I will not go into the details of it because that would require a separate talk altogether. But this is something that we know, that for any toric rotation, this is the kind of loss of vision. So sometimes for a mild rotation or a mild 10 degrees, some patients may accept, depending on patient to patient and the spherical cylinder combination. But otherwise it will distort the vision and one will need to go in and rotate the ICL. But why does it occur in the first place? Especially, I mean, the issues which are getting better with time, but this is the main thing which, because the ICL, the guidelines which are available, as you can see. So for example, I've given here, suppose you have a white to white of 11.7. According to the STAR ICL guidelines, they would give you a 13.2 millimeter ICL. And even if it is 12.3, that is what around that they would give you the same. So now there is a difference in the AC depth, there is a difference in the vault. So this customization is a little difficult with the ICL, and this could lead to variations. So you have to be very aware of these things, and especially if the AC, again, if you're a little borderline, it's around 2.9, 2.95, then again you need to be aware, more so in a toric ICL, but also in spherical ICLs. So, but of course, in toric ICLs, we tend to go for a little larger vault. But with the Indian ICLs, I think this is a little advantage because they seem to offer a little more variations and customizations. So these are the advantages that I do not have any personal experience of using the IPCL yet. I've used the Biotech ICL, but they also have a similar calculation guidelines. And this would be my last case. I think all of us have been wondering about the halos which occur, and a lot of us put the blame on the central flow, the central opening. But I think in my experience, I've rarely. Can you hear me? Yeah. I've just remember in all maybe one or two patients who would complain a little more of some halo consistently, but they also with time would have adapted to it. Apart from the fact that some of them may complain of a ring around, especially in the dark conditions, which is fairly common because of the optic size in certain eyes and the pupil sizes, it may vary. So this was one case in which kind of made me think as to what is it, how does it, because it goes against. So this was the uh, position of the central in the first eye that we operated, and I was concerned what is happening. So I checked everything, all the parameters, and nothing came up. So this would be my last slide. Let's wind up. And because nothing came up, we went ahead and did the other eye, and that also showed a symmetrical variation of the central flow. So obviously there was some difference in the anatomy of the ciliary body or something, which kind of displaced it or kept it. But she was totally asymptomatic and had excellent vision. So this was just one last case, just to understand, because I don't know if anybody else has also faced some halos and things. But if it is on the side, it should definitely show some. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashish. The time is very short. My talk is there, but I will just sum up the whole thing in 1 minute. I can share my screen, simultaneously talk. And if you have any questions, then we can personally talk with you. 1 more minute to go, and no problems. I have my talk on the LASIK problems. Basically, when everything else is okay, and this is my topic: perfect patient, uneventful procedure, excellent results, still post-operative problems. We have been talking of so many other problems, that this has happened, that has happened, everything, so many things we have talked in this instruction course. I just wanted to highlight few other points like bacterial keratitis, which is a real problem. It has happened in so many times. It has happened very rarely in our practice. In the last 15 years, we have faced only 2 cases. And what we learned from this is we have to check for any blepharitis, myocarditis, complete asepsis, clean the eyelids with betadine, don't reuse the instruments, and post-op instructions on patient hygiene. After especially doing the LASIK, patient should be not going for swimming for at least 1 month or any sauna. Avoid crowded and dirty places, dusty places. The next will be DLK or sands of Sahara. Nobody had mentioned this before, but this was not in the topic. What we have learned from these complications is that powder-free gloves should be used, minimum use of topical anesthesia, and thorough cleaning of the flap bed, and proper monitoring of pressure during treatment. I am just running through my slides so that everybody gets the message. These are very, very rare problems that we face. Steroid-induced glaucoma, or PISK, refractive or pseudo DLK. What we learned, any pressure greater than 18 millimeter mercury, more than that, we should taper the steroids fast or immediately stop if we see any cleft of fluid inside the, as you can see in this slide here, there's a cleft of fluid. Because of high pressure, this can lead to blurring of vision, and use anti-glaucoma medication where possible. Post-op LASIK dry eyes is a very big topic. So we have to, what we can ensure is take a proper history and do at least a Shermer's test before, where we have suspicion, before taking up the patient for LASIK, and check their vitamin D levels. Post-op, give them cyclombutane or omega-3 fatty acids. Retinal detachment is again another problem. Even we have had retinal detachments in patients less than -1 diopter, -1.5 diopters. What we have to do pre-operatively, we must check for at least any lattices with holes. And these days we have become more cautious. Any lattice we find, we just generally before LASIK, we must do a laser barrage and take an informed consent. And if there is any flap dislodgement, this Piyush had talked wonderfully. After 1 week of there were patients who have come to us after 1 week of surgery, even after 6 months of surgery, because of some accident, or they're into certain sports like boxing. So these patients suddenly come up, they are perfect patients, everything was going on well. Then we learned strict post-op instruction not to rub, and PRK or smile is preferred in contact sports, like Dr. Gaurav also mentioned in his talks. So I'm just running through the slides, excuse me for this presentation, but post-LASIK epithelial ingrowth is another factor. What we learned from this is don't reuse blades, avoid diabetics, proper pre-op corneal examination, and this can be treated with YAG laser capsulotomy also. I will not go on to the post-LASIK headache and dizziness. This is a very big topic. Loss of accommodation happens to so many patients. We just have to listen to the patient's problem, advise them for some orthotic exercise, relaxation in between work, and generally these post-operative accommodation problems disappear in 1 to 3 months. And anxiolytics for a good sleep. So these patients generally settle on their own. But one patient I really wanted to discuss, which had a problem of this glare, halo, and starboard, that was more of a psychological problem. But certainly, definitely, if there is a pupil size is very large, we have to be very careful, explain to the patients, especially with high myopia and astigmatism, treat the post-op dryness. Mostly they will disappear. But in certain cases, they may not disappear. Post-LASIK ectasia I will not be talking about, time is very short. These are the what we learned is surface ablation, PRK extra in doubtful cases, ICL preferred in higher powers, always take proper consent, and tending loving care. I wanted to discuss one patient, especially in this instruction course. Time is short. He was a psychiatric patient. Everything went on well, minus 1.5 diopter, minus 2 diopter in both eyes. And there was no previous medical history. On day of surgery, he did not come with any friends or relatives. He kept on postponing his surgery. First post-op day, his vision was perfect. 10th day, he said, my birds are moving outside. I have a poster outside my shop. The birds are moving in and out. 15 days, he gave me 15 missed calls. On 16th day, there was a glare, headache, all problems. He was called up for follow-up. His vision, IOP, cornea, everything was fine. Next day, again, he starts complaining. I'm having increasing complaints, missed calls. He kept on troubling me. The patient was psychiatric. When we had a counseling with the family, we found that this problem was not in the LASIK procedure, but it was the patient. The patient was the problem. He had a psychiatric problem. He was already going antipsychotic treatment before the LASIK surgery, which we missed. And when we sent the patients to other renowned doctors about his problem, his family went him. He started blaming the other doctors also. He blamed his LASIK surgery for his loss of fiancée also. He had a broken engagement. So we even lodged the report with the police because he kept on threatening us. He gave us life-threatening calls, and I will break up the clinic and everything. So what we learned from this is that take history of antipsychotics, anxiolytics, note any unusual pre-op behavior of the patient. Patient who does not want to sign the consent form, don't do the LASIK, don't operate if patient has come alone to the center and without consent. And with this, I will end my talk. I was very, very brief. I hope you understood the message. This was a wonderful instruction course. Thanks to everybody, Dr. Bhalla, Dr. Ashish, Dr. Gaurav, Dr. Piyush, Dr. Jaya. And it was a really, really interesting session. And I have learned a lot from all experiences shared by each other. Thank you very much, everybody. Dr. Piyush and Dr. Gaurav and Dr. Ashish, Dr. Bhalla.
Thanks, everyone. It was a wonderful session.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you, doctors. That was a wonderful session, wonderfully moderated by Dr. Neeraj. Sorry, doctor, we had to rush through the last session.
No, I had to rush through, but the messages were the same. So our last message was the same. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.